I'm Maida Owens with the Louisiana Division of the Arts Folklife Program. With me today from the division is Kelsey McCrary. She's going to be helping me with the logistics and reminding me to do what I'm supposed to do. We also have our new executive director, Susanna Johansson, with us. She's been with us for 2 months now, and welcome. We have a wonderful panel scheduled for y'all. I want to give you a little bit of background about the Bayou Culture Collaborative, and then turn it over to our moderator for today, Jeffrey Darensburg. If you didn't attend our first public series in this series of workshops, it was climate change, migration, and sustaining Louisiana's culture, and the link is in the chat if you missed it. And it gives a good introduction to some of the issues, goes into some of the research and such. And Louisiana's response, the Division of the Arts response and such. So I encourage you to watch that if you didn't see it. Today we're going to focus in on the role of the artist and arts organizations. And while there's much to be done, I want to acknowledge that there really has been some amazing work by artists and arts organizations in the state, and it's continuing. And we've invited some of those that are most active, but I assure you there are many others that have been doing this type of work. If you're not familiar with what's going on the coast, you must have been living under a rock or a mud pile. But this really is a statewide issue. A lot of people think of it as a coastal issue, and it's not. It's a statewide issue. And as pointed out in the last workshop, North Louisiana has its own climate change environmental issues with the droughts and extreme precipitation that's been going on there. So, but this is a statewide issue, and I truly believe that artists and arts organizations have a special role in helping communities understand what's going on and how they can participate. Artists have a unique way of being able to reach people that reports and conferences simply don't address fully. So today, Jeffrey Darensburg is going to guide us through a discussion about the artists and arts organizations. Jeffrey has a PhD from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He is a member of the Attakapaw Ishak Nation and a native of Baton Rouge, Point Coupee and Baton Rouge and Lafayette. He's lived quite a number of places across South Louisiana. He's currently a fellow at the Center for Louisiana Studies at UL Lafayette. And so he's going to take you through to explore some issues. And so I turn it over to Jeffrey.
Sorry, I had forgotten to unmute. Thank you very much, Maida. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this meeting. And I'm really happy to be here with some fascinating people, Amy Rogan, Sam Oliver, and Brendan Belanger, all people who work in the arts. Sam is from the Acadiana Center for the Arts. Brendan is a working artist out of Arnaudville, Louisiana. And Amy is director at a studio in the woods, which is Tulane's Arts Campus on the west bank of Orleans Parish. Brendan and I have both been residents at a studio in the woods. We were both there at the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm especially happy to see him again. And thanks to all of you, and thank you, Maida, for wanting to address this issue, which is an issue that many of us who work in the arts think about quite often. So maybe it's just as a general question for the three of you, Sam, Brendan, and Amy. Just in general, how does the state of the world influence your work in the arts, or what is your general approach to integrating social issues into what you do? Brendan, how about I start with you? And don't forget to unmute. If any of you have questions, please mute your microphones, but if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat and we will get to them in due time. Brendan?
Thank you, Jeffrey. Really, it's the impetus and motivation and strong inspiration to try to tell the story of being a human being at this moment in history, facing, a mass extinction crisis, as well as increasing climate crisis, and increasingly trying to think of ways that through art, science, and activating communities, we might be able to save other species and perhaps ourselves along the way.
Amy?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jeffrey and Maida. I would say, this is the question we live with at Studio in the Woods kind of all the time, because we view, our place as a place to inspire and foster kind of artists and scholarly reactions to the challenges of our time. So this is precisely the space we live in. I would say, as a native Louisianian and New Orleanian, for me personally, supporting artists and our communities to really address, vision, lead ourselves and the rest of the country and possibly the world on these topics is really like where I live. And at the same time, like Brandon said, like save this place in the process. So that's micro to macro. And I guess my short answer is yes, we think about that all the time. How can we create conditions for artists and scholars and thinkers to thrive in this time?
All right, and Amy, I guess you had some slides, and let's begin with those. I think Sam's, is Sam back on or has?
I'm back, sorry.
Oh, okay, Sam, would you like to take a shot at that question, namely, how does the state of the world influence your work in the arts, and what is your approach to integrating social issues into the arts?
I think the state of the world for me, one of the reasons that I work in the arts at all is the state of the world, especially in kind of small, tight-knit community spaces, and how the arts are especially transformative in close communities, how they can kind of open up a knot that sometimes is tied really tight, or that can connect people together that otherwise are really dispersed. And obviously we see how communities can be so vastly impacted by social issues on any scale, global, local, etc., and how that can have either a really polluting effect or sometimes a really positive and transformational effect. But I think at the local scale, arts and the cultural space is how we actually connect with one another in a human scale.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that answer, Sam. I like that very much. Amy, you had brought some slides with you. Could we maybe start by showing those? And
Yes.
I think there's a video in there, and maybe talk to people a little bit about what Studio in the Woods and sort of is and sort of what you do there.
Yeah, certainly. So for those of you that don't know, we are a program, as was mentioned, of Tulane University, of their Bywater Institute, and we're located on 8 acres of carefully preserved bottomland hardwood forest, which is located on the west bank of the Mississippi River. So we're downriver from what people think of as New Orleans / Blancha, but we are still technically in the parish. Our founders purchased the fallow sugarcane plantation about 50 years ago in 1969. And over the years, they sought to protect the forest, not only for its value as a wetlands, but as a powerful source of creative inspiration and education. They were both our founders, Joan Lucy and Carmichael, were very involved, deeply involved in public education. Fun fact, Joe Carmichael was the first lobbyist for public education in the state of Louisiana. And so they were very devoted to this and retired and built their homestead and their studios, and then formed the nonprofit A Studio in the Woods in 2001. We have a program of active forest preservation, and we have a botanist on our staff who manages and researches the forest and has done so since 2004. And we've had a number of stressors to that forest since that time. Sorry, 2004. We also provide science-inspired art education through a summer camp. We have a festival in November 13th this year, and school partnerships. But at the core of our programming is providing a protected, peaceful retreat for artists and scholars. So you can move on to the next slide. So this shows some of our compound, little thumbnails from our website of some of our compound. Most of the spaces are made of recycled, built out of recycled materials, except for our newest space, the writer's cabin, which we just completed in late 2019. And we now can host up to 3 artists at a time. And so since in our 20-year programmatic history, we've hosted more than 150 artists and scholars from all disciplines into mostly competitively selective residencies throughout the year. Residents are granted 1 to 6 weeks of staff-supported creative work time, room, and board, along with a generous stipend and materials budget. The majority of our residencies are thematic, and they often respond to current events and are grounded for us in the interplay between art and science, between humans and the natural world. It's important to us that the work in a residency have an impact in our city and our region and our state. And to this end, artists who apply must propose a self-described significant community engagement component. We have staff who facilitate this engagement and link residents to our local schools, environmental nonprofits, neighborhoods, individuals who can partner in the process and also in the presentation of work. We love to partner with presenting organizations, winking at you, Katie Anna Art Center. And every year we see a significant increase in applications, which indicates this to us that artists are eager to engage on topics of environmental and social issues that we support. And we've really seen an increase in applications from local and regional artists. And I say this to this art audience in particular, because we interpret that as evidence of ownership and expertise of the issues informed by the lived experiences of what we're facing in South Louisiana. So when I said before, I really feel very strongly that we know something here that is of value to humanity. And so I like to say that as much as I can, because I don't know that we always take ourselves seriously here in Louisiana on all issues. So whether from New Orleans or the US or other countries in which each of these artists have been provided time, space, support, and a stipend for the creation of new work. And we can move to the next, and then we'll get to a video. But I wanted to, these are covers from some of the catalogs from our previous series. Prior to Katrina, we were offering space to artists who applied, and it was Katrina that really pointed to us, post-Katrina rather, and what we saw as the extreme challenges to our community, to artists, to the land, and we formed a series of residencies called restoration residencies. And since that time, we have done 3-year cycles of residencies addressing environmental and social themes. Many of those have been in responses to catastrophic environmental events. It's not just Hurricane Katrina, as we know, Deepwater Horizon spill, the crises, ongoing flooding. There are changing land, the way that the land moves beneath our feet, the water rises. We most recently completed a series called Adaptations, Living with Change. And, we really have been driven by a collective community need to have artists help us lament and rage and understand and ultimately find hope after each of these crises. And it seems that the crises are now ongoing. And, with the deeper sense of urgency around global climate, the global climate emergency, we've just last year began our most recent series, Rising Residencies. And we're encouraging artists to propose more active projects seeking intentionality and transformation for our species and the planet. We intentionally try to make these themes as broad as we can, as containers for artists to come in with all different kinds of responses and projects. And I want to stress that we really welcome artists of all disciplines. We've had writers and filmmakers and visual artists and scholars and just really anyone who can make a case for using the space. So the next thing I'd like to do is show you all just a brief video we completed after with all the adaptations residents who were here from 6 weeks in residence from 2017 to 2020. We invited them to answer a series of questions after their residencies and sort of like what has been your time like at Studio in the Woods, and really what is the role of the artist during this time. And so we'll play that now.
No longer deny, that the fires are raging and the storms keep coming and the water is rising. It's the role of the artist to connect all of these times of past and present.
How do we create sustainable futures for future generations, in intersectional kind of ways, and looking at like our relationships to the earth, to each other.
Well, I'm excited about participating as an artist that's healing, that's conjuring and alchemizing old wounds, and the artist that's creatrix. Artists can be sort of midwives to welcome people into the fact that this crisis is very real.
The work that I create sort of addresses all the stuff that we humans have done to sort of be the cause of change in the environment.
With Indigenous people in Louisiana, part of our fundamental identity is the environment itself. And with that environment changing, trying to figure out how to maintain that identity.
And to think back to where we're from, where we go, hope that someone could be touched, has a direct reaction with the project.
Looking at how the landscape is constantly changing is kind of like foundational. We as humans have to kind of come up with some new creative solutions to how to live with water and adapt to our changing climate.
I think artists can ask different kinds of provoking questions. What are the ways that we're using art as a service to the planet, as a service to each other? And what is art? It's the exploration of the imagination.
I think another role of the artist is to have a radical imagination, is to very bombastically imagine a different scenario for us and to project that scenario through our imagination and to actually build it for people to see.
Art is one of the most powerful organizing tools that we have, one of the most powerful tools for change. Artists have the capacity to reach for what people's deepest wishes and dreams are.
Being an artist feels like so much responsibility. We need to dig into our minds, our bodies as dancers, dig for elegance,
creation is part of adaptation. You do something, you experiment, and then you see if it works. It's a halfway between like the research process and the creative process, and also the collaboration with science.
This is an amazing place that really gets it and knows that it's going to take a kind of multi-tiered, multidisciplinary approach to really change the way that we're engaging with our environment. All humans are obligated to give their, whatever their unique expertise and passions are to the climate crisis.
This is a multidisciplinary challenge. We all need to be learning each other's dialogues. We all need to be communicating in as many ways as we possibly can to make a difference.
We've learned how to adapt in the most like dire circumstances, like even when it seems like there's no hope and there's no reason that we should be surviving, we see ourselves and we know ourselves as part of the land. So our freedom is interconnected and we need each other. Yeah.
Thank you so much for showing that, Kelsey. And also, it reminds me of having pandemic hair while I was. Amy, Amy, I'm going to address this question towards you because the adaptations residency, many people spoke about, at least in that video, spoke about preserving things in the face of change. One of the things, just for example, that I worked on a lot there was my own tribal language, Ishakoi, and I made the first Ishakoi film and a few publications that make use of the language. What do you think is what do you think is really a thrust of what artists there have seen as worth saving, or what do you think is worth saving, say, for your great-grandchildren? What would be something you would want to have for them that we're in danger of losing? And I'm also going to address that question to Brendan and Sam. And just what would you like to see them have in the future? I'll begin with you, Amy.
You know, I've been sitting with that question of Maida's ever since the last, I think it was on one of your slides, Maida, from the last presentation that you all hosted. And I've really been sitting with it. I mean, on one level, it's like parades and music and all the things that I love. And then on another level, it's, I think most precious is the gift that like arts and culture, one of the many gifts that arts and culture give to us, which is a sense of ourself and a sense of each other. And if we don't have that, wherever we go or whether we stay or however we are in the future, we're going to be in trouble. And to me, having a sense of ourselves and each other and our collective power and wisdom is something that the arts can give us and which we very much need right now in this moment, but I sure don't want to lose it in the next set of generations either. So I guess that's my kind of more expansive answer besides all the things that I enjoy and love as a Louisianian. You're muted, Jeffrey.
I'm terribly sorry. Sam, do you want to have a shot at that question as well? Thank you, Amy.
You said Sam?
Yes.
I mean, it's also a very serious question. My wife and I just had our first child. And so, you know, there's a lot of time reflecting on even what I want my own son to see, which as we start talking about climate change and land loss, you know, just casting 20 years in the future can be a scary prospect, but thinking about, you know, a great grandchild, let's talk about 100 years from now. I mean, I have to think about the connection I have with my own great grandparents in one way or the other, and the ways in which traditions have either been carried or not carried, and how those connections have been, you know, kept, and in some cases, you know, really not. So I hope for my great grandchildren, for that future generation, I hope that we can share some common language, and that I can even help be a good, you know, passer down of those things that have survived from my great grandparents, which includes things like language, especially the French language in Acadiana. Dancing, partner dancing is just so important. If you don't know how to do it, please learn. It's good for your soul, it's good for your psychology. If you know how to dance with somebody, you know how to dance, you know, outside of physical movement too. A lot of great lessons there. But those are things that are just so interwoven with the culture in which I live, that have come through previous generations and really don't exist anywhere else in the same way that they do here. And hope that the little fragments that we have remaining in the small communities we have that celebrate them, I hope we can steward those in a way that's authentic and meaningful for our great grandchildren.
Thank you for that, Sam. Brendan, I saved you for last in this because I've noticed that in your own artwork, there is a tremendous push for various types of preservation in a way that intersects between preservation of ideas and preservation of physical objects. I was thinking about you in particular the other day in relation to this event, because I was thinking about what are the oldest objects I own. You know, I have a corn sheller from my grandparents' farm from the 1920s. I have a 1903 photo of my great-great-grandparents. But a lot of your work deals with various types of preservation, and maybe this would be a good segue. I know you had some slides, and maybe you could talk maybe in detail about your own artistic practice based on those, and that'd be a way of talking about like what it is you think is particularly worthy of preservation, or what is the thrust of that in your work, if
Sure.
You don't mind.
That would be great. If you want to start the slides, that would be super. Well, just in general, like when I start thinking about culture, I think of the way that culture is shaped by, you know, the environments and ecosystems and organisms. You know, the human cultures are shaped and shape the plant and fungal and microbial communities around them. But we're super interconnected, and as such, when I think about what I want, you know, great grandchildren or grandchildren, you know, people in the future to experience, are some of the aspects of South Louisiana that are so incredibly special. Like I want, you know, great grandchildren to see monarch butterflies. You know, like, you know, this species that may disappear within, you know, a few decades if we're not careful, and because of changes to climate, but also changes from agriculture and you know, Cajun prairie. I want future generations to be able to experience that, and bottomland hardwood forest, thinking about Studio in the Woods. Migratory songbirds, the 3 subspecies of alligator snapping turtles we have in Louisiana and nowhere else, or the 77 endemic species in the Gulf of Mexico of fishes. These are fishes that are found nowhere else on the planet except for in the Gulf of Mexico. And anyway, I think about that in terms of human culture. And before I get really started, I'll share a story from this portable museum project. I was showing it in Point Ocean, and I'll show a slide in a minute. And I was talking to one of the elder fishermen there, and he was telling me when he was a boy, his father took him out and they caught a sawfish. You know, this is one of these creatures with the bill that comes out with the spines on the side. They're kind of very flat. They almost look like cross between a ray and a shark, but they have this very distinctive bill with spines on the side. And he said his father, they caught the fish, they brought it on board. It was this massive thing. And the whole time I'm thinking, this is crazy. There aren't sawfish in Pointe-au-Chien, there aren't sawfish in the bayous. He's like, yeah, they were really common. And but the whole time I'm like, that's not possible. Like they're at this point, they're endangered, they're extremely rare. I mean, they're found in a few spots in the Gulf of Mexico, they're protected. But the idea that they were there, I thought was completely, something he was making up. And he said, when we brought it on board, it gave live birth. And out came this sack in which this baby sawfish, pushed its way out of. And that is exactly the way a sawfish gives live birth. And only somebody that saw that, or a biologist, would kind of know that detail. So it showed me that I needed to listen better from elders and people that had experienced that land and learn, and then think about that, like that story that he cannot share with his grandchildren. And how can we fix that? How can we bring the sawfish back? And how can those stories come back? But anyhow, to talk a little bit about my work, Jeffrey, you said preservation. This is probably a good work to start with in that regard, dealing with specimen preservation. This really, to me, isn't it's a sculptural installation called Collapse. To give you an idea, if you haven't seen it in person, it's a little over 400 jars with preserved specimens from the Gulf of Mexico following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. They represent a little over 370 species, which is a tiny, tiny little fragment of the amount of life that's actually found in the biodiversity as far as species. It's less than 3%. So if you imagine this installation is about a little over 12 feet tall by 15 feet wide. If you had another 97 of these sitting in a space somewhere, that's what we know just currently about the amount of organisms in the Gulf of Mexico. But it's, there's still so many things we don't know. There's so many species we're describing all the time. So this was what I call a sculptural reaction. It was made in collaboration with 3 other biologists. But one of the things in science that is wonderful and limiting is science, of course, is based on factual discovery. So you build evidence. And so this was just 2 years after the oil spill, the 2010 BP oil spill, which still remains the largest oil spill in history, and certainly one of the largest environmental catastrophes in the history of the United States, beyond agriculture and the Europeans arriving. So this being number 3, the amount of oil that spilled into the Gulf, we estimate to be over 200 million gallons. Half of that oil, we believe, remains in the Gulf of Mexico. We're not sure. It's mixed in with sediment. A decision was made to use chemical dispersants called Corexit. And what they did is they broke the oil, from it floating at the surface. It was broken apart, molecularly made heavier so that it would sink. Now, the problem was when it was sinking, then with the Gulf Stream, it was really spreading all over the place. So we're not really sure it's hard to gauge how widespread the spill was. And because of the use of dispersants, it made the oil much more toxic and harder to break down. Naturally, in the Gulf of Mexico, you have microorganisms that eat oil. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico is filled, certain areas are filled with oil, so there's always seeps. And naturally, you have microorganisms that break them down. However, when you exit it, it slows that process. So then one of the things that the other biologists and I were afraid of is what happens when that now more toxic oil enters the food chain. And that's how this piece really was created. So on one hand, it was about speculating and thinking about how this oil could impact various levels of the food chain. At the same time, the work really was, if we want to go to the next slide, it was intended as a kind of memorial As you can see, the way that everything was stacked, it was this giant pyramid where you couldn't really see, you could see the first like 2 or 3 layers of jars. But each one of the specimens, literally, I tried to curate. So you can see they're kind of placed. These are actually stitched onto glass inside of the jar, inside of liquid. So you're not just seeing something sitting on the bottom. So it's something to pull your eye more towards the center. And again, this was not meant to be didactic. It wasn't meant to be a scientific display. It was meant to really be a memorial, but also when people start to look at it, to be amazed and hopefully awe-inspiring, making them think about just, how much diversity there is in the Gulf. Because most of us, when we think of the Gulf of Mexico, we think the water's really muddy or it's really contaminated. And, we think of shrimp and redfish and oysters, but we don't think of all that other diversity. And, all of those things are true. There are areas that are heavily polluted. There are areas that are, really, really have a lot of turbidity. However, all the seafood that we're gathering, that's just a byproduct of this incredibly resilient and productive, massive environment. So there's still so much that we don't understand, that I was hoping that in a way this could create this kind of dialogue or continued interest in, wanting to learn more. And then hopefully from that desire to want to learn more into trying to protect what we know is there, and also encourage people to continue to push for understanding the impact of the oil spill and trying to understand how we can prevent this from happening in the future. So Collapse is going to be shown at the Acadiana Center for the Arts this fall, if you have an opportunity to come to Lafayette and visit to see it. And then I think we're going to try to show it next spring in New Orleans with Antenna. So I've always wanted to bring it to Louisiana. That's been a dream. It's traveled since 2012, literally all over the country, but it's never been in Louisiana, and it's finally time that it comes home. So next slide, please. So I mentioned this portable museum. So my family and I moved from New York City to South Louisiana, to Arneville in 2016. And I began, my background, I should say, is I am an amphibian biologist working in the fish lab at LSU, and now starting to do fish work with Tulane. And so I'm really kind of like a frog out of water, or frog in salt water. I don't know, it's a bad joke, but amphibians aren't normally in salt water. So I'm still trying to learn after living here for 5 years. But one of the things that I learned during Collapse is I met so many folks between 2010 and 11 and 12 trying to do volunteer work to rescue birds, and inevitably collected just hundreds of specimens. But I met just incredible people in Plaquemines Parish and Grand Isle and later in Acadiana, and just really fell in love with the community, so much so that my family and I moved down here in 2016. And one of the first things I wanted to do is try to do outreach with these communities, instead of bringing them to go see an installation like Collapse, to bring a museum to them where they're living, whether it's Pointe-au-Chien or whether it's Homa, or whether it's in Venice or Phoenix. I was really interested in working with rural and isolated communities. So Crude Life started with a scientific study at LSU with Prasanta Chakrabarty, was the lead biologist on that, the curator of ichthyology at the Museum of Natural Science at LSU, myself, and a couple of other folks. And we wanted to see, out of those fishes, the endemic fishes in the Gulf of Mexico, which ones have been reported since the 2010 spill. So there are a couple of online databases that you can Google, or you can look at these data sets to see which specimens have been collected in natural history collections. And we realized that there were 14 species that have been missing of those endemics since 2010. So literally, we created, working with a whole team of great artists and other scientists, we created this portable museum and started bringing it to fisher folk communities and blessing of the fleet ceremonies and farmers markets and marinas, and made these wanted posters, which you can kind of see in the distance behind some of the specimens. And it had those missing species on it, and tried to work with community members to find them. And then also work with community members to contribute to the museum if they wanted to. And it was really great. We ended up finding one of the missing species on one of the field trips, which was really rewarding. And we want to go to the next one. Kind of continuing in that spirit, working with Studio in the Woods and Tulane University, and specifically to Plaquemines Parish, over the next couple of years, I'm continuing this search for missing species. And the thing is, out of those 77 endemics in the Gulf of Mexico, there are about half of them we don't know anything about. They were collected once in a shrimp net off of Grand Isle, or somebody, found one in Pensacola Beach, and they managed to save it, and preserve it. And it ended up at the Smithsonian or Tulane or somewhere. And but we know very little about the natural history of these species. We know very little about, what they need as far as ecosystems or how they fit in these ecosystems and environment. So working again with fisher folk and coastal communities, what I really want to try to do, and specifically communities that are at risk of what I call cultural extinction. I want to use the looking for the fish as a metaphor for working together to try to go out and look for these missing species, but also think about ways that we can adapt and try to think of art and science projects that may help us become a little bit more resilient and create through art. I love, Sam and Maida, what you were saying, the way that art, has a way of reaching people in a really unique way. And Sam, how you said that to connect it, art has a way to connect at a human scale. I really believe that. So these portraits that I'm making are made out of oil. So it's a Deepwater Horizon oil mixed with the Taylor oil spill, which is an ongoing spill that's been ongoing since 2004. It's like, probably the second largest spill in human history, as far as we know, that nobody talks about. This is also the Taylor energy spill is in Southeast. It's just out of Plaquemines Parish, as was Deepwater Horizon. So trying to work with oil field workers and actually have them do some drawings and paintings like this as well. So this is one of the missing fish. This is a portrait of one of the missing fish. It's called a Highflin Benny. It hasn't been seen in a little over 2 decades. So this will be an ongoing project in Plaquemines Parish, and the idea being that we'll do field trips at the Succus Field Collection, or the Succus Fish Collection, which is the second largest preserved fish collection on the planet outside of the Smithsonian, which is in Belle Chasse. And we'll actually try to get oil field workers and fisher folk to come, and I'm going to do drawing classes with them, but then I'm going to go out with them and hopefully learn about the environmental changes that they're seeing. Try to think of creative ways we can catalog that, but really try to build resilience in ways that we're taking those stories and their art and bringing it outside of Plaquemines Parish, but also trying to get communities that live next to each other to communicate more, because culturally they're very isolated. And the more that you can build these ties with these communities, interweaving them through art or through citizen science, just ways to communicate, the more resilient they'll be, and hopefully they can adapt to these changes that we're seeing. So next slide, please. And in thinking along those lines about adaptation and changes and things we can do, this is when we moved to South Louisiana, we ended up, my family and I, my wife and our 2 little kids, there was only one at that point, we bought 9 acres of soybean fields with a little tiny broken house. So the little broken house has been fixed a little bit, but the soy fields, we started to replant and renature, if you will. So we took all the soybeans out and tried to start immediately planting different clovers and plants that would then create a cover crop, but could actually remove some of the pesticides from the soil, and break them down in an attempt to kind of create a nature reserve and eco campus, what we call a Tilia de la Nature. And so we've been working with Restoring Cajun Prairie. I talked about how I hope this will be around in future generations. We're at about 22 feet above sea level, so we'll see how long we last. But we've done a lot of restoration. So now there's a wetland in the back. We do community programming where we invite community youth to come in. We do experiential art and science and environmental education. And we're working on building trails. And I would say Studio in the Woods is one of the inspirations, certainly, and hopefully a future partner, as is the ACA. And we do community festivals as well. So we do this great thing called the Halloween Art and Nature Festival, where we get about 25 organizations. We invite artists and scientists and naturalists and conservation people and oil and gas people and shrimpers, and they all come together and we celebrate the rich culture that we have. And we tell stories to each other, and we go on haunted hay rides, and we learn from each other. And it's a day-long event that's really celebrating the special nature of South Louisiana. And when I mean nature, I mean not only the natural history and the ecosystems, but again, the cultures that drive those ecosystems and have been driven by those ecosystems. So we've grown a little bit. We're up to about 25 acres, thanks to the support of patrons, and I invite you all to come out. The hope is that as we continue to grow, we'll hopefully have some dormitory sites and other sites where we can host artists in residence and scientists in residence, but also importantly, I think in times of emergency, if certain areas are flooded, maybe people can come and stay, or get out of the way of the storm if possible. So we hope to be able to host that in the future. The other thing that I think we should mention, that I want to mention, is we're exploring, we're talking about loss of culture because of climate. We're trying to push back the other way too. We're really interested in how you can, I'm really interested in how you can recreate habitat, re-nature to help sequester carbon, to help do our part to actually slow climate change and to make sure that you have ecosystems that can withstand heavier storms. So we're looking at the way prairie grasses can sequester carbon, and thinking about like how really as individuals, what kind of difference we can make to help terraform in the other direction instead of just giving up. I do believe that we're going to have to many parts of our state, we're going to have to retreat. But I also believe that there's a lot of restoration that we can do, which can make a difference. So I'll leave with that.
Thank you very much for showing that, Brendan. You gave me your book last time I saw you, and I have looked at it many, many times. So it's just nice to hear you talk about that. One of the things while you were talking about, I was thinking about this, my own work of dealing with tribal cultural preservation of the Attakapaw Ishak Nation, of which I'm a member. I just remember standing on a shell midden in Vermilion Parish, a place called 4 Mile Cutoff, and that there's a ship channel that runs straight through the middle of this ancient midden that's covered in pottery shards and everything, and it's a ship channel to take people to the Gulf of Mexico. And for all I know, my own father rode on it at some point. My father was a retired oil field worker. The chief of our tribe is a retired oil field worker. A lot of members of our tribe are oil field workers, and a lot of my friends around the Attakapaw district, which I will always call Acadiana. So when, and I was also thinking about AMA, talking about how there's been an increase in number of people seeking residencies. I know that grants have become more competitive. I've been lucky enough, knock on wood, to get a good bit of grant funding this year, but they are seeing more and more applicants. And there is a crunch of arts funding, it seems. At the same time, there are people who are getting involved in arts funding as a way of sort of deflecting criticism in some way. A few years ago, Mel Evans published Art Wash, which was a landmark book about the way the petroleum industry has attempted to steer arts funding in Britain in order to influence arts funding to not be steered towards art about climate change. I know a lot of people in Louisiana work in the petroleum industry. I've written about my own ambiguity about that. Have you noticed anything in Louisiana? Like, what is the relationship between the very politically prominent petroleum industry to arts fundings and arts discussions about this issue? If you've encountered any sort of pushback or have any thoughts about that?
Jeffrey, quick pushback. Acadiana is a Tacapal country, and Eshok and Chitimacha and Opelousas, a little bit up there in the north.
Bob, you're not my favorite person, I want to tell you.
But also, I mean, I'll speak on my side, but I would love to hear Amy, especially talk on this subject. You know, in Acadiana, there's, you know, a huge basis of workers, workforce that you know, earned a living and built wealth and generational wealth in the oil and gas industries, and less so now as well. And I think that sense of scarcity and desperation also makes it even more of a you know, tighter cling in some ways, as opposed to what I would hope is let it go. But when it comes to, you know, funders and institutional funders, you know, I have the benefit, being outside of New Orleans, of getting to look over at those big oil and gas funders that support the arts extremely heavily, like, for example, the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation, directly connected to, you know, funded by the, what is it called? Brandon, you gotta help me out.
Taylor oil spill.
Yes, the Taylor oil spill. You know, you Google the Taylor name, and what comes up is not the Taylor oil spill, but it is the $7.5 million they gave to the Smithsonian. So I think it's been, you know, whether that's genuine philanthropy or whether that's effective public relations, I have no way of knowing specifically, but I see the result. And I know that we don't have that discussion in the cultural spaces, and in some spaces like Press Street Antenna Gallery, you know, with Fossil Free Fest, which has hosted that. You know, it still is an outsider art space. It is not the Contemporary Arts Center. It's not the New Orleans Museum of Art. It's not one of the institutions that would not host an event like that, probably, because they are institutionally tied to the Hellis Family Foundation, aka Hellis Oil and Gas, and they, you know, those dollars are substantial. And as somebody who's the executive director of an organization, and you know, is responsible for staff members whose salaries I pay and who then support their families, I get it. I sympathize completely, which is why, being outside of that area, I know that those organizations aren't going to give me money anyway, so I'm very happy to criticize them. Amy?
Yeah.
I said it so you don't have to, all right?
No, I so much want to, of course. My dad too worked in the oil industry. And, you know, I mean, obviously we look at so many things. It's Hellis, it's Shell, the Jazz and Heritage Foundation, you know, that Jazz and Heritage Festival is funded by Shell, and, you know, they, to the degree that it's the Shell Jazz and Heritage Foundation Festival. I mean, it's not even that they're just giving the money to quietly support arts and culture. It's that they're giving money to brand very specifically and link themselves with these large, you know, cultural treasures. And I was really inspired. Of course, Fossil Free Fest is just such a brilliant, I look forward to its return that you mentioned, Sam, that is put out by, you know, the Antenna hosts. And there, it was the brainchild of probably a few people, but certainly Imani Brown, who is a really brilliant artist and thinker who's doing a lot of research right now. She's in London getting a degree, and couldn't name it exactly. Maybe someone could put it in the chat, or link to her website. But she's really she's done a lot of work at tracing the lines back, like exposing what is so unexposed in our state, the degree to which the oil industry subsidizes so much of what is going on. And, I think I was looking at one of these questions about, if Louisiana becomes uninhabitable in 3 generations, what should we be doing now? Well, I don't want to leave before the oil industries do. They need to go first, and then we can decide whether we're leaving. And so, that's just, but it is a really hard, as you said, Sam, you run an organization, there's things that you want to do and that wouldn't happen otherwise if you didn't have these resources. And it's hard. The system's kind of broken. I personally love getting funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and from the Louisiana Division of the Arts, because I see those as, money that's been, that juries, it's peer selected and peered, and the money is from our tax dollars. And I just, otherwise the system is challenged and kind of broken. And so how do we move forward in that system? And how do we move forward with everybody? I'm not interested in alienating people, but I think we need to, how do you critique something and then take money from it as well? It's a really suspicious and challenging place we find ourselves here in Louisiana. And again, I want to encourage us to sort of take, like, what can we show the rest of the world around this? Oil is so important here in Louisiana, but is it really? Is it really our most important asset? No. So
I'll just make
say it now.
because you're obviously in hardwood bottomland, so much of the wetlands and those bottomland forests are specifically decimated through saltwater intrusion because of the creation of, pipeline canals that were never backfilled, that were never, mitigated after the fact in the way that they might have been intended to be, but certainly nothing was done with it. So, you look under the rug any direction, and, any level, I'm sure any type of major industry will have ecological impacts, period. Ours is the oil and gas industry, but it is an industry that is fading from this state, period. It's just a fact through the state of of Louisiana laws, of how lawsuits have worked out. The oil and gas industry is departing from the state, and we may be continuing to participate in that industry in some ways for time to come. But also those institutional dollars that tie up the voices of some of our real cultural leaders, those dollars are going to dry up as well. They may eventually become purely family foundation dollars, in which case, like the Ford Foundation as a separate entity from the Ford Automotive Company, the Ford Foundation has its own separate mission that is more, seeking of equity and seeking to uplift voices and not suppress them. Maybe that will happen.
Thank you for those very candid answers, and they do speak to like a real tension. I know that I'm not the anti-oil worker. I mean, again, my father was an oil worker. Chief of our tribe was an oil worker. Many of my dearest friends and family are oil workers. And then also as an artist, though, you have to tell the truth about what you're seeing or about what has happened, etc. And I think those two things are reconcilable. It means a commitment to understanding people on all sides of a thing, and what are their pressures and what are the things that motivate them. And I think that's a really important thing. Speaking of people, and this is like a last sort of big question for me, and I'd like to receive some questions in the chat. And Meyer, I think your question was answered in the chat by Cami Hill Pruitt. But I'm going to ask, because some of you have mentioned this in various ways, how does your work specifically relate to communities that seem to be bearing the brunt of the impact of climate change. The impacts of climate change are not distributed evenly. And this has been written about extensively, but also many times in Louisiana, the people who feel the brunt of climate change, either through land loss, through increased extreme weather, for example, or living in parts of cities that happen to flood a good bit, seem to be disproportionately people who are just generally disenfranchised in our society. How does your work address those communities in particular?
Well, I can jump in. In some ways, I feel like we're not addressing, relating to those communities enough. I mean, but then it's all, in some sense, a matter of degrees, right? I mean, New Orleans itself is in a way endangered. And so the communities in New Orleans are endangered. And of course, there are, the artists that are here trying to do work are struggling. And so we do, I mean, kind of directly to answer your question, we do, for every call that we do, we make sure that we prioritize Native and Black artists, other artists of color in reaching out to make sure those artists apply, and making sure those artists are on our jury, and making sure those artists are equitably part of the selection process. As a response to COVID, and what we saw is just such, how COVID just laid bare such gross inequities that have existed for centuries, right? We responded to that by forming or putting together a residency program called Relief Residencies for Black and Indigenous and other artists of color locally, to just give them stipend and retreat in our woods to work on whatever it is they were working on. So we tried to answer that, to respond to that. But then at the end of the day, I know there's so many artists that we aren't reaching, and really who are like much more, I mean, New Orleans is considered a frontline community when you think of the nation, but we're not a frontline community here in South Louisiana. And so, we're always looking for ways to engage in those communities. And this is a very open invitation to do that. I'm using this platform to do that. If you have a project or an idea, or want to either apply for a residency or talk about doing some kind of special collaboration, or at some point in the future is looking at or partnering with communities. We bring artists from different parts of the country and the world who are really interested in engaging in a respectful and sustainable way with our communities. So that's what we try to do. And hopefully we get better and better at it.
Thank you for that, Amy. Sam, you touched on it a bit, but I'd like to hear you talk about it a bit.
Well, I think it's, the organizational purpose for Acadiana Center for the Arts is to be the cultural development agency, kind of the responsible party for the cultural sector in Acadiana. And that runs from, coastal communities up to Brandon's neck of the woods, or neck of the prairie. To me, there's across that geography, there's a lot of particular different issues. And we're going to think about, I think what Maida has really talked about in the course of the Bayou Culture Collaborative, and teased out the idea of the movements of families along geographies and along watersheds. As lower latitude communities become unlivable by the definitions of, the average person. They'll move north, and, it's our job to concern ourselves with the people who are having to move and the communities that are receiving them. And it's an extremely complex issue, but we'll be in the conversation. We don't have the solution, but we'll be there. And, but I'm also thinking about the, maybe kind of the psychological or community geography too, which is in a lot of these groups that we're talking in insular ways. We're speaking to one another. We're speaking to the people who maybe are already on this Zoom call or were on the last one as well. And I think that's good, because we need to do that to, get our ideas straight and come up with actually good thoughts, and have a critical process. How do you critique and take money? That's a criticism we need to really continue to talk about. But also, if we're only speaking to one another and not to the communities in which we live in a way that's accessible, then we'll very quickly speak ourselves into complete irrelevance. I think there's some interesting thoughts. I don't really have a more developed idea about it, but there are interesting thoughts about preservation versus conservation. Obviously, in a lot of land and wildlife, Louisiana is a big conservationist place because it means you still get to hunt. As opposed to a preservationist, which is more of the national park route, which means the land be as untouched as possible, except maybe for interpretation. But they're different approaches. And I'm sorry, I totally forgot what your real question was.
For someone who says he has undeveloped ideas, you sure say some good stuff. So, I found, I'm not sure exactly what I asked, but that was a very interesting answer, especially that tension between conservation and preservation, which is, and then the issue of sustainability comes in there. Joni Hammonds, who was on the Zoom, asked an interesting question, which all these statements seem to relate to, and I'm going to read it. How can we add arts and culture as a communications tool in the toolbox to augment the state's ongoing initiatives related to climate change and adaptation, such as task forces, etc., and expand the statewide conversation from its current focus on economic impacts and larger industrial transitions? I'm going to say something a little bit. I think it's the first question I'm going to try to answer a little bit, is that one of the things I really learned a lot of lately is how much of an economic impact the arts have. It is a tremendous investment anytime arts are invested in. It pays off time and time again. It makes communities vibrant. It makes communities live, and it is a great investment. But I'm going to turn that question over first to Brandon, and then the other two of you. This is a great question. Thank you for asking it, Joni.
Well, just to jump in for a second, I had to Google it. So 26% of the overall funding in Louisiana comes from oil. So 26%, that's our whole economy, right? So oil doesn't necessarily fund all of Louisiana all that much, but they certainly have a lot of lobbying presence, right? So agriculture is actually the biggest one. But yes, as you say, like art's having an economic impact, and this has been this huge push for creative placemaking because we've seen over and over again, it's offering new possibilities for communities that have undergone decline, depending on wherever that is in the world. It could be Liverpool, it could be Arnaville for that matter. So thinking of ways that I think one of the immediate things we could talk about is the relationship between arts and culture and tourism. Right? I mean, we live in a very special part of the universe because of the rich cultural history we have here. Regardless of the climate impacts we're having, this could be another very, very relevant source of income, I believe. Ecotourism could be enormous here. It's bizarre. We have more protected land. Now, given it's conservation, it's not preservation, Sam, but we have more protected land in Louisiana than Costa Rica. So Costa Rica makes billions each year off of ecotourism. We make very, very little because we don't market what we have, for one thing. Secondly, the arts as part of that would just be very complimentary, and talking about how, you know, people already realize the food culture of Louisiana. They realize Cajun country, you know, but ways to tie this in so that you're attracting people that aren't just coming to go to Bourbon Street, but ways we could, you know, really sell like how rich the different areas of our state are. And I think, you know, that would be an immediate way that we could try to support arts and how they could further economic develop, but also move away from the same conversation about who's funding everything all the time, that 26%. Like we realize that we have to move past this anyway. So it's just another opportunity I think that could be tapped into.
Thanks, Brandon. That it's great to get those statistics. You know, my first thought, I love this question because, right, it's how do we be in conversation and community together around, I mean, we have to, right? We have to be together in any of these conversations. And my first thought is to make sure that there are artists at some of these tables. You know, and even if it's not clear what the reason for the artist is, you know, it's like the conversation will go better if there's a poet in the room, if there's a sculptor in the room, if there's a, you know, whatever, to reflect back, to reframe, to be, you know, to just have seats at the table, because decisions are, you know, there are conversations happening, there are decisions being made where there aren't artists at the table. And so I think how that happens could be really interesting to figure out, and how those artists are selected and what support they have to be there. And what comes out of that could be really interesting things to explore, but just getting them in the room would be my first and highest answer to that.
Thank you for that, Amy. That is such an important point. Just getting the people in the room. I find that, you know, Brandon, I don't know if you agree with this, but I seem to think you do in your practice. Is just that practicing artists, really, the things we make art about, if they have any kind of social issue, we usually spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about it, like reading about it, researching it. And I think artists often have an interesting take on something, or maybe you might notice something others have not noticed. And that's an important point. Sam, you also work with government agencies, or at least some of the time, at least. What is your take on that?
Right, yeah, that's it. So also, yeah, I'll chime in. Great question. Two answers to it. The first and simplest answer is, I think when we talk about working with other sectors and agencies, we really need to know what language they speak. That's kind of when I think about insularity in our arts community. We're good at speaking to one another, and we're good at teasing and attacking issues, and that's great. But when we're speaking to, say, you know, the Planning Commission, we need to understand them as, you know, as a type of audience in some way. You know, they have their own language, they have their own goals, they have their own skills and things they bring to the table, and they have gaps in all of that as well. And so I think it's to be able to understand that and really find out how we fit in the picture is a task, and it's a big task. Fortunately, there are actually, you know, the best thing to do, I think, and Jody may agree with me, you know, is if you want to convince the planner that you're part of their plan, you know, put it in writing, or go to a previous plan and say, well, in this previous plan, on page 163 of the regional adaptation strategy, subcategory B3, it says support healthy communities, regional culture, and recreational access to nature. So we need to do that as a part of the watershed initiative, as a part of these strategies, that many of which are following from previous work done. All of that work, if it's done well, as some of it has really been, does already begin to approach cultural issues. Do they understand the cultural issues? No. Do we? Sometimes. But I think, it's, literally in the LA Safe final strategy document, there is a section on cultural recommendations, and it's on page 163. And I think that's the kind of thing that can be, brought around and used to the benefit of everybody, but to the benefit of this type of work, because it might also, when we talk about funding, to Jonathan Forate's point, bring those dollars into this sector that aren't coming from oil and gas, but are public dollars, that are taxpayer dollars, that can help elevate and fund this type of work. And it's already ostensibly written into the plan. Is it written into the budget is the other question. So when we get $50 billion or whatever number for, master planning the Gulf Coast, and trying to, shovel buckets of water out of whatever, you name it. which Bayou, Jonathan? That we're at the table for those conversations. Just a brief story, and this is just to demonstrate how we're really not doing it. But I know from conversations with Susanna, who's the new executive director of the Louisiana Division of the Arts, Ameda and Kelsey's boss, that's in the the target is to bring cultural representation, artists, organizers to the table for those, especially statewide conversations. In the course of this past year, through the pandemic, there were many of these state commissions, et cetera, that were formed, that were having discussions about, community development, about tourism, about entertainment, about you name it, economic development. And on exactly none of those statewide committees was there any representation from, an artist, or the owner of a bar, or, non-mega million restaurant chain. Very little cultural representation in the sense of people who are actually living and doing the work. So that is a task. But I think it's a big present task. And fortunately, I think we have some alignment in the cultural organizers and leadership to get that done.
Or just for a second, Sam, I wanted to add to that just for a second. There's a lot of precedence for this kind of activity outside of Louisiana, especially in Europe. And I think I saw Patricia Watts on here somewhere earlier from Eco Art Space. So in the eco arts community or environmental arts community for the past 50 years, people like Helena Newton-Harrison have been working with city planners to adapt to climate change even back in the 70s. So we can do it. It's like what you're saying, Jeffrey, it's about doing this research and looking at precedents of the way it's taken place in other areas effectively, and then try to model that for what we have here. And places like the Netherlands, I mean, they've been living with water for, since the Netherlands became the Netherlands, right? So they have a history of working with artists to deal with communities there and actually do restoration projects, remediation projects. And so I think that would be a great other meeting, Susanna, if you're listening. Let's sit at the table and come up with ideas.
Thank you for the great answer, Brandon. I also like to point out, since you mentioned the Netherlands, that our indigenous nations along the coast of Louisiana have dealt with the Gulf of Mexico and its vicissitudes for the past several thousand years. And The other day, I saw a supposed new initiative for shoring up the Gulf by recycling oyster shells. And it's like, and I thought, well, I'm glad that y'all have caught up with us for this thing we've been doing for the last 10,000 years on the coast. We took a couple 100-year break, and maybe there are other things that we are doing that you can catch up with too. That would be nice. All right, we're almost out of time. It's 4:22 and we have till 4:30. So what I would like to do, I'm going to ask y'all a question and I would like quick answers. And that question is this: often scholars who work with climate change speak of a certain sense of urgency. What should we be doing right now if Louisiana, say, or the coast of Louisiana, not all of Louisiana, but certain of our cherished coastal spots might become uninhabitable within 3 generations? What do you think we should be doing now to address that? And short answer, I'm going to start with you, Amy.
Anything and everything we can think of to do right now. It's actually that urgent, and it very much includes all kinds of work around. Sorry, I'm going to just say a little bit more, which it includes, the work of, anti-racist work, bringing Indigenous communities to the center. This type of work, all this type of work that is how it's going to help us progress and solve this solution, and all the things we haven't done or thought of yet. So all of our resources, I would posit, need to be directed here.
Thank you, Amy. Sam, quick answer.
Everyone should find out who is on the Senate Appropriations Committee or the House Finance Committee, or it's the other way around. Select one of those members, preferably somebody in their region generally, and work over the next 6 months to take them to lunch and then explain to them why you give a damn about this. I think that'd be the most effective thing anybody could do.
I love that answer. And Brendan, quickly answer the question: if parts of Louisiana might become uninhabitable in 3 generations, say the next 70, 80 years, what should we be doing right now?
Remediation. We know remediation works. We know conservation works. We know diversions work. We know there's science there. We have to mobilize, get the funding in place, prioritize the areas that we can save, look at the areas that we can't, and work with the communities located in all those areas and try to collectively adapt.
Thank you very much, Brendan. And thank you for all of you panelists. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. You have so many fascinating ideas. And Maida, as the host of this meeting, I would like for you to give us a few words to close out. Thank you so much for attending, to all of you, and for your questions.
Thank you. This was a fabulous panel, and it met all my expectations and more. It is part of a continuing conversation of, as I've said in other settings, that we don't necessarily have answers, but together we can move towards them. I think the most important thing is for the arts and culture communities to become part of the community resilience conversation. That is the phrase that they recognize. It's becoming part of the community resilience conversation. And at this point, we basically are hardly there. They've started noticing some of the things that we've been doing, but there's so much more as we're really not at the table hardly. And so part of the goals of the Bayou Culture Collaborative is at least to get to the table. We recorded this. It will be posted online in the next few weeks. But if you don't know, you can save a chat if you want these links sooner. If you look over in the chat at the bottom, there are 3 little dots where type a message here. You can save your chat and not have to wait for it. There's a lot of interesting links that people added in addition to ours. If you want to, at the very beginning, and I think some second place is how to stay in contact. If you're not getting messages through Constant Contact from the Division of the Arts, I encourage you to go to our homepage and sign up for the various lists. There are quite a number of them, and I have a feeling a lot of you would be interested in getting some of the messages that we send out. Thank you for coming. I will stick around for a little while in case people have questions or need, trying to save the chat.